Between the pages of her ledger, he found a note begging someone to come for her. The ledger had been sitting on the corner of Harlan Prute's desk for 9 days before he opened it. He'd found it in the ruins of the Alderman place, out past Cutter's Creek, tucked under a collapsed beam that the fire hadn't reached. The cover was black leather gone soft at the corners. He'd carried it back in his saddlebag thinking it was accounts, cattle numbers, feed tallies, something the Alderman family might want when they came to collect what was left. Nobody came. The family was gone, the way families go out here. Scattered or dead, or two broke to make the ride back for what little the fire left standing. So the ledger sat on the corner of his desk. He was done with the army by then. Done in a way that doesn't have a clean story behind it, no wound, no single bad day. Just a long, slow wearing through, like a boot heel gone flat on one side. 17 years of scouting for the 7th, and then one morning he'd woken up in a bunk at Fort Reno and looked at the ceiling and thought, I don't have anything left for this. He'd turned in his papers that same week. Major Corbin had looked at him the way men look at a horse that's gone lame in both forelegs and said quietly that he was sorry to lose him. Harlan had shaken his hand and ridden north. He'd taken a place near the town of Dillon, in the shallow valley where the Cimarron runs slow and brown in summer. 160 acres of thin grass and red clay, a house that needed a new roof on the north side, a barn that needed everything. He'd been working on it for 8 months, working on it with the particular focused blankness of a man who knows that if he stops working he'll have to sit down and think about what he's done with his life, and he isn't ready for that conversation yet. The desk was in the front room. He ate at it. He kept his receipts in a tin on it. He cleaned his rifle on it. The ledger sat on the corner and he walked past it 100 times. He opened it on a Tuesday night in October, when the wind off the plains had come up cold and he'd run out of things to fix for the day. He sat down at the desk and pulled the lamp close and opened the cover. It wasn't accounts. The first 30 pages or so were accounts, columns of figures, livestock tallied, wages paid, the careful hand of a man who ran his ranch the way you're supposed to run it. But somewhere around page 34 the handwriting changed. Smaller, tighter, a different pen, a different ink, lighter in color, like someone had been diluting what they had. A woman's hand, he thought, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Something in the way the letters turned. He read. It was a record, not a diary, not quite. There was no asterisk dear anything at the top, no date until the 4th entry. It was more like she'd needed to put things down somewhere in order to keep track of herself, to confirm that she was still a person who thought and felt and remembered. He'd seen that before. Men in long captivity did that, kept private counts, private records, private rituals, just to hold on to the thread of who they were. She'd been at the Alderman place against her will. That much was clear from the 2nd entry. She called the man who'd brought her there Cade. Nothing else, just Cade, no surname, no rank. The things she described, Harlan read carefully and without expression, the way he'd learned to read a scene, gathering information, not feeling it yet, putting the feeling away for later when it wouldn't get in the way. Then, near the back of the ledger, he found the note. It wasn't folded into the pages. It was pressed flat, written directly on the inside of the back cover in the same small, careful hand. And it wasn't written to a diary. It was written to a person, to whoever might find this. If you are reading this and you are a good person, please come for me. I am being held at the Alderman Ranch on Cutter's Creek. My name is Nora Vass. I was taken from Millhaven 14 months ago. I am alive and I am not broken. Please come. Below that, smaller, like she'd almost not written it. I know this may find no one. I am writing it anyway. I would rather do a thing that might fail than do nothing at all. Harlan sat for a long time, with the ledger open on the desk. The Alderman place had been a ruin when he'd found it. 6 weeks ago now, maybe 7. Fire, and before that some kind of violence. He'd read the ground the way he always read ground, out of habit, and it had told him a bad story. 2 men down, one of them in the yard, one of them in the doorway. Signs of a horse taken fast from the pen. He hadn't found a woman's sign. He hadn't been looking for one. He sat with his hand flat on the page. I am not broken. He could hear the wind working at the corner of the house where the chinking had gone loose. The lamp made a small sound. He looked at the date on the last entry she'd written. 14 months ago she'd been taken, but the entry was more recent than that. 8 months ago, maybe. And the fire at the Alderman place had been, what? 6 weeks before he'd ridden out there. So she'd still been there 8 months ago, and then something had happened and she was either dead or she was somewhere else. He closed the ledger. He sat for a moment longer. Then he got up and went to the hook by the door and took down his coat. Millhaven was 4 days' ride southeast, near the Kansas line. He'd passed through it twice in his Army years, a town of maybe 300, a grain depot, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, the particular stillness of a place that had lost more people to weather and hardship than it had ever gained from commerce. He rode in on a gray morning with frost still on the grass and tied his horse at the rail in front of what the sign said was a general goods store. A woman inside looked up when he came through the door. Behind her on a shelf he could see bolts of cloth, tins of tobacco, a row of glass jars. He asked her if she knew the name Nora Vass. The woman's expression changed in a way he recognized. That particular tightening of the face people do when a name brings pain and they're deciding how much to show. She said yes, she knew the name. She said Nora Vass had been taken from the road between Millhaven and the Gannett Creek settlement 14 months ago, coming back from caring for a sick family out there. She said no one had found her. She said the girl's aunt, Mrs. Edna Vass, lived on the east end of town, and that she'd aged 15 years in the 14 months since it happened. Harlan thanked her and went back out. He stood in the cold for a moment. His horse shifted and blew. He found Mrs. Edna Vass in a small house with a kitchen garden gone to frost, and a cat sitting on the windowsill. She was perhaps 60, with white hair braided tight against her head, and the hands of a woman who'd worked hard all her life. She looked at him the way women out here learn to look at strangers, taking measure, not afraid, just careful. He told her who he was. He told her what he'd found. He set the ledger on her kitchen table and opened it to the back cover. She put her hand over her mouth. She stood like that for a long moment, reading the note that was her niece's handwriting. Then she sat down and looked up at him with red eyes and asked him what he meant to do. He said he meant to find out what had happened to her. It took him 11 more days. The trail from the Alderman place was cold, 6 weeks cold, but cold trails had been his work for 17 years. He picked up the thread of a man named Cade Yarrow, who had a history running from Indian Territory up through the Oklahoma line. He'd had a partner, a man named Sills. The fire at the Alderman place had been the end of their time there. One way or another, Sills was buried on the property. Yarrow had ridden out with a horse and a woman, heading east. Harlan followed it east. He found her in a town called Pardo, 40 miles inside Kansas. Not in good circumstances. She'd been left there, Yarrow had ridden on without her, for reasons Harlan would piece together later, and she'd been taken in by a woman who ran a laundry on the edge of town. She'd been there 3 weeks. She was working for her keep. The woman who'd taken her in told him Nora Vass was the hardest-working woman she'd ever seen, and that she didn't sleep well, and that she never cried where anyone could see her. He found her in the back room of the laundry, standing over a tub in the steam, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled up. She was perhaps 30, or she'd been 30 before the 14 months, it was hard to say now. There were things in her face that hadn't been there before, he could tell, even without knowing what she'd looked like before. A watchfulness, a set to her jaw. She turned when he came through the door, and she looked at him without flinching. He said his name. He said he'd found her ledger at the Alderman place. He said her Aunt Edna was alive and well and wanting her home. She didn't cry. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands in the soapy water, and she said, I wrote that note 2 years ago in my mind and 8 months ago on the paper. I'd stopped believing anyone would come. He said I came. She looked up at him, just looked at him. Something in her face shifted, very slightly, like a door coming off its latch. She said, You rode all this way for a woman you don't know, on account of a note in a burned ledger. He said someone needed to come. It seemed like it ought to be me. He gave her 3 days to settle her arrangements with the laundry woman, who she paid back fairly for the weeks of room and board, keeping accounts the way her ledger-keeping suggested she kept everything. He watched her do it and thought about the kind of person who, in the worst circumstances, still keeps accounts, still writes notes to strangers, still does the possible thing rather than nothing. He slept in the livery for those 3 days. She brought him supper the second evening, a plate covered with a cloth, cornbread and beans, and she sat across from him on a hay bale, and they talked for the first time without the specific weight of what he'd come to tell her hanging over the conversation. She asked him about the army. He told her. She asked him about the ranch. He told her that too, the thin grass and the red clay and the roof on the north side that he'd fixed 3 times and that still wasn't right. She asked him why he'd left the army. He thought about it. He told her the truth, that he'd woken up one morning and found he had nothing left for it. She looked at him with those careful eyes. She said, I know what that feels like. I also know it isn't permanent. He didn't answer that, but he thought about it for a long time afterward. The ride back to Millhaven took 5 days, slower than his ride out because she wasn't a hardship rider and he wasn't going to push her. The first day she was quiet. He didn't push that either. He'd spent enough time in the field to know that people coming out of hard circumstances need time to let the world get real again, to trust that the good thing in front of them isn't going to be taken back. The second day she talked more. She told him about Millhaven, about the family she'd been nursing when she was taken, about the road and the evening light and how she'd had no warning. She told it plainly, without performance, the way people tell things they've already made their peace with, or are working on making their peace with. He listened and didn't offer her comfort she hadn't asked for. The third night they camped in a draw out of the wind and he built a fire and made coffee, and she sat close to the warmth with her coat around her shoulders and said, without looking at him, Do you have people? He said he had a sister in Missouri he didn't see enough of. She said, That's all. He said, That's all. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I didn't either before, just Edna. I thought that was enough. Now I think a person needs more than enough. I think a person needs to matter to someone. He looked at the fire. He said, I think you're right about that. She looked at him then. He could feel it without turning. She said, You matter, you know. Whatever you think about yourself out here on your own with your broken roof and your thin grass. You matter, you came when I asked. That's not a small thing, that's not nothing. He didn't have an answer. He'd spent a long time, longer than he'd admitted to himself, out there fixing fence posts and re-roofing the north side in the dark, thinking that he was exactly nothing. Used up, past the place where he'd be of use to anyone. The army had been his purpose, and when the purpose was gone there was just the red clay and the wind off the Cimarron, and the particular silence of a man who doesn't know what he's for anymore. He said, It's been a while since anyone said that to me. She said, Then it's been too long. She stayed with Edna in Millhaven for 6 weeks. He rode back to the ranch. He fixed the roof on the north side again. He ran fence and broke ground on a kitchen garden he'd been putting off. He didn't know what he was doing exactly, except that something had shifted, some small essential thing, like a wheel back in its bearing. He slept better. He woke up and didn't look at the ceiling the same way. She wrote to him. Her handwriting in a letter was the same as in the ledger, small, precise, economical, except that the letters had warmth in them now that the ledger entries hadn't, because the ledger entries had been written in the dark. She wrote about Millhaven. About Edna's kitchen garden and the cat that had adopted them, and the way the town had received her back. Some people fine about it, some people strange. A few women who looked at her the way women sometimes look at women who have come back from hard places, as if the hard place were her fault. She wrote about that plainly, without self-pity, with a kind of dry clarity that made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled in a long time. He wrote back. He was not a practiced letter writer. His letters came out stiff and short, a rancher's plain sentences, facts more than feelings. She didn't seem to mind. She wrote back to his facts and asked questions that opened them up, that made him explain things he hadn't thought to explain. He rode to Millhaven twice that autumn. The first time he told himself it was to check on her progress, a man's reasonable concern about a woman he'd brought home. The second time he didn't bother with that story. Edna made him supper and left them in the parlor, with the particular deliberate tact of a woman who has decided she approves of something and wants it to proceed. They sat across from each other and she said, "Tell me about the ranch." So he told her, the red clay and the thin grass, the 160 acres and the slow brown river, the barn that had needed everything and now needed less, the kitchen garden he'd finally started, the roof on the north side that he thought he'd finally gotten right. She said, "I'd like to see it." He looked at her. She looked at him straight on, that same level gaze she'd had in the steam of the laundry in Pardo, no flinching, no coyness, just a woman saying what she meant. He said, "Then come see it." She came in early December with the first real cold. She rode well, he hadn't known that, hadn't thought to ask. She came up the track toward the house and looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they're sizing up for what it could become, not just what it is. She stayed 3 days. Edna had come too, which was appropriate, and Edna had opinions about the kitchen garden placement and the north side roof and the way he'd laid out the barn interior, and she delivered them with the cheerful authority of a woman who has been waiting her whole life for someone to consult her on ranch design. He found he didn't mind. On the last evening, after Edna had gone to bed, he and Nora sat on the porch in their coats with the cold coming off the plains, and the sky so clear the stars looked close enough to trouble. She said, "I've been thinking about your letter, the one where you said you didn't know what you were for anymore." He said, "I shouldn't have written that." She said, "Yes, you should have. It was honest. I'm glad you did." She paused. "I've been not knowing what I'm for, too, for a long time, even before. I was a capable woman with a small life, and I told myself that was enough, and I wasn't sure it was, and then everything happened, and now." She stopped. He waited. She said, "I think I was waiting to be found, not just from that place. I mean before that, too." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars. Her profile in the dark, that strong set to her jaw, the particular stillness she had, that way she held herself like a woman who's learned not to lean on anything that might move. He said, "I think I was waiting too. I just didn't know what I was waiting for." She turned and looked at him then. The lamplight from the window touched the side of her face. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, not tentative, not asking, just placing it there, warm and certain, the way she did everything. He turned his hand and held it. She said quietly, "You came for me." He said, "I did." She said, "I'm glad it was you." He didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He held her hand in the cold and looked out at the Cimarron Valley going dark under all those stars, and something in him, something that had been tight and locked and going through motions for a long, long time, let go. They married in Millhaven in the spring, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, with Edna in the front pew and the cat somehow present on the windowsill as if it had been invited. A small thing. 12 people, maybe 15. The preacher was a young man who did his best. Nora had brought almost nothing from her old life. She'd left most of it behind, deliberately, the way she'd left the laundry in Pardo, settled fare, not looking back. She brought her books. She brought a small tin box of letters. She brought the ledger. She put it on the shelf above the desk in the front room, the same desk where he'd opened it that October night. He'd asked her once if she wanted to burn it. Some people would. She'd said no. She said it was a record of a person still being a person under bad circumstances, and that she was not ashamed of it, and that she might want to show it to her children someday. He thought about that, about children. It was something he'd stopped thinking about, somewhere in the hollow years, the same way he'd stopped expecting a good morning. He thought, all right then. The roof on the north side held through the winter. The kitchen garden came in strong. She kept his accounts, of course she did, in that small precise hand, columns so clean they made his rough tallies look like a different language. She was better at the business of the ranch than he was, and she knew it, and so did he, and neither of them made anything complicated out of that fact. He built her a writing table by the window that looked south, toward the Cimarron. He didn't ask permission or discuss it. He just built it one week when she'd gone to visit Edna, and it was there when she came back. She stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. There were things in that look he didn't try to name, just received them, the way a man receives a thing he's been given that he knows he's going to hold on to. She crossed the room and sat down at it. She put her hand flat on the wood. She said, "This is a fine thing, Harlan." He said, "I thought you might want a place of your own to write." She looked up at him with those steady eyes. She said, "I've got a place of my own now, the whole of it." He nodded. He went back to what he'd been doing. Outside, the river moved brown and slow toward whatever was east of them. The grass was coming up green that spring, greener than it had been the year before, or maybe it had always been that way, and he just hadn't been paying attention. A man starts paying attention again when he has something to pay attention to, when there's a reason to look at the color of the grass. He was 51 years old and had a good woman who'd found him as much as he'd found her, and a roof that finally held, and a kitchen garden that was going to do well, and 160 acres of thin soil and red clay that felt, for the first time, like a place that was his. Not because he owned it, because she was in it, and because she'd looked at him, a used-up man, a man going through motions in a house too quiet, and decided he was worth coming back to. He didn't need more than that. He had more than that anyway.